Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. We're going to talk about some extremely famous things in American history. The 13th Amendment, the end of the Civil War, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the start of life after the Civil War. Wild stuff to talk about today. Let's go ahead and get started. Abraham Lincoln is famously known for ending slavery in the United States, as he should be known for that. However, it wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation that did it, that happened during the war. That was actually just to keep England and France from coming and helping out the South by making the North look like they're against slavery and the South supports it. The thing that's actually going to end slavery is the 13th Amendment. Now, Lincoln, while he is going to end slavery, that wasn't his original goal. His views on slavery actually drastically changed throughout the war. While he personally always hated slavery, I should clarify that. He wasn't ever like pro-slavery and then became anti-slavery. He was always personally, morally against slavery. He didn't know if the federal government even had the authority to end slavery, even if it wanted to. That is what is going to change throughout the war. He realized that the war was fought over slavery, and that if the Civil War ends, and at this point, if you remember in this story here, Robert E. Lee is getting beat by Grant. It is a war of attrition. Grant basically is going down below Richmond. Lee's having to chase him. Lee knows he can't keep this up. Then Sherman just starts setting the South on fire and says he won't stop until Lee surrenders. The surrender and the end of this war is imminent. Lincoln knows he's got to do something about slavery now. Originally, and this is a quote here from 1862, this was at the start of the war, where his quote is, "My paramount objective in the struggle," talking about the start of the Civil War here, "is to save the Union and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Lincoln's basically saying, my only goal is to bring the country back together. We'll worry about slavery later. As the war goes on, his views change. By 1865, he says, "Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally." He aggressively starts not only turning against slavery, he's always personally hated slavery. But he starts changing his mindset over this concept. Does the federal government have the right to tell the states whether or not they can or can't have slavery? You know, this is abolitionist level talk back in the 1840s, 1850s. The William Lloyd Garrisons that says the federal government should outlaw slavery, should be part of the Constitution. They were like the crazy people back then. Like, you're not going to go into South Carolina and tell them they can't have slaves. That's never going to happen. Lincoln says, nah, I think it's time for it to happen. And Lincoln writes the 13th Amendment. Now, an amendment is a change to the Constitution, a permanent change. The 13th Amendment says slavery is illegal in the United States. Outside of, like, if you're a prisoner and prisons can make you go do work, outside of that situation where it's like forced labor when you're a convicted prisoner, slavery in the United States is completely outlawed. Like, that is the 13th Amendment. Lincoln, as a president, he can't just write it and then be like, it's now law. It has to be passed by Congress. There's a very specific reason that Abraham Lincoln needs to do this right now. Because Republicans are against slavery. The Democrats support slavery. However, there's not a lot of Democrats in the federal government because almost all the slave states are in the Confederate States of America. If Lincoln waits for this war to end, and they bring the North and the South back together like he wants to, and all those Democrats come back into Congress, then they try to vote on the 13th Amendment, and a change to the Constitution has to have just wild, overwhelming support. It's going to be like 50-50. Republicans are going to want it, Democrats aren't, and because of that, it will never pass. Lincoln knows he has to pass this amendment while it's basically all Republicans in Congress. And it's not even going to be easy, because remember, there's 5 slave states that are still part of the United States of America, and they're clearly not going to vote to support the ban of slavery. So Lincoln basically needs like 100% of the Republicans to all vote to abolish slavery, which you would think it would be an easy thing to do. Lincoln he writes this, it is a very close vote because you basically have to have a unanimous vote. And there's a lot of people that were going back and forth on this, Republicans, on whether or not they want to go this extreme with it. But it does pass. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. So now the South is on fire, is getting ready to surrender. When the war ends and they're forced to come back into the United States and they have to pledge allegiance to the Constitution again and follow the Constitution, guess what, South? There's a new rule in the Constitution. Slavery is banned. All right? So Lincoln had to pass the 13th Amendment at the very end of the war because had he waited for the South to come back in, it never would have passed. So the 13th Amendment is passed. Slavery in the United States is going to be outlawed. That officially does end slavery in the United States with the 13th Amendment. So again, the surrender we're getting ready to talk about, and all this is kind of happening at the same time. So when the 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865, slavery, not only is every slave freed in the United States, it then abolishes slavery. Like you can't go grab another group of people and make them slaves. Slavery is officially illegal in the United States. So the question here is, what was so significant about the timing of the 13th Amendment? Why did Lincoln know it had to be passed right then, at the time it was passed, or it may never pass? So we talked about that. Pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So let's hop back to the war. Lee sees that Sherman is setting the South on fire. There's no army to stop him. He doesn't have the amount of troops that Grant does, the guy he's actually fighting. He's basically being pulled further away from Richmond, so he can't actually even defend Richmond. Richmond, and it's a really interesting thing, Richmond catches on fire at this time and burns down. You would think that'd be a big part of this course. We don't really know why. We think that when, at this point, it looked like Richmond was going to get taken over, that probably what happened is a bunch of Southerners were burning papers and trying to hide it, or like, I don't know what and accidentally started a fire. Either that or one of the Southerners set Richmond on fire, trying to blame it on the, regardless, there's no evidence that the North set Richmond on fire, but Richmond does catch on fire, and it pretty much burns down. So at the end of the war, Richmond is destroyed, but it basically, by the time Grant or anybody gets into Richmond, it's already done. Like, it's already burned down. The South blames the North for it. The North is like, we literally set the whole South on fire during the Civil War and claimed that. We did not do the Richmond. So Richmond does catch on fire and burn down at the end of the war. And to this day, there's still an argument and disagreements over why that happened. But it wasn't Grant. But the surrender is going to take place. Lee says, all right, if Sherman will stop setting stuff on fire, I'll surrender. As soon as Lee says this, Sherman's like, cool, we won't set anything on fire. And Sherman does stop. So here's it's not that weird. It's a cool story, though. You see Richmond here on the map. There is a town called Appomattox Courthouse. Bear with me here. It's really weird. The name of the town is Appomattox Courthouse. Not that it's the courthouse in the town of Appomattox. It is the town of Appomattox Courthouse. So this just happens to be where Lee is when he's like, all right, we're done. I'll surrender. I'm going to surrender to Grant. That's the guy I've been fighting. So Lee agrees to meet Ulysses S. Grant at a guy's house. It's not even at the courthouse in Appomattox. I don't even think Appomattox has a courthouse. There's like one house in it. It's this dude's house, who just happens to be the guy's house that they're going to use for this surrender, and they make him leave because they need to use his kitchen for this. So the surrender is going to take place at Appomattox Courthouse in this building that is not a courthouse. Again, that's such a weird, the name of town, Appomattox Courthouse. Anyway. So the story here is really cool and interesting as well. So this is the paintings, and there's multiple paintings of this, and the paintings don't really tell the story because there wasn't anybody painting this as this is happening. This is done afterwards of what people want to show what happens here. So this is Grant in this painting shaking hands with Lee. Now that did happen. So they're going to meet at this house. Lee and a couple of his men show up before Grant gets there. Lee, as always, looks like $1 million. He's always very official, whatever. And Grant shows up second. Now, Grant did some things that was kind of weird. A couple of things, because we need to talk about Grant's a little bit here at his personality. Grant is a known alcoholic. That's one of the reasons that he didn't rise to general until the Civil War. He is a severe alcoholic. Everybody knows this. The kind of interesting thing about Grant, which is kind of unique, is while he was an alcoholic, he never drank like while on duty, and there's really no evidence of his severe alcoholism affecting any of his decision making. Spoiler alert, he's actually going to end up being the president of the United States as a severe alcoholic, but his alcoholism really doesn't seem to negatively impact any part of his life, which is extremely rare. But not only does Grant show up probably smelling like alcohol, dude smokes 20 cigars a day, which cigars take a long time to smoke. I don't even know how that's humanly possible. So he's showing up smelling like alcohol, smelling like a cigar smoke. And one of the things in this picture, and here's another painting, because I want to find multiples and they never kind of show it right. That's Grant sitting down watching Lee at this surrender. That Grant here is wearing his general's uniform, as is in these paintings. He actually wasn't. Grant really irritated the Southerners during the war because he wouldn't ever wear a general's uniform. He just wore a private's uniform. Remember, there's not really any pictures. Nobody knows what Grant actually looks like unless they've seen a painting of it. They're typical soldiers. So he would just wear a private's uniform like everybody else. So if they got captured, they wouldn't know who the leader was. So it just kind of seems like you're breaking the rules of war at the time. So it's one of the things that frustrated the South, knowing that the commander for the North, Ulysses S. Grant, you can't even pick him out in battle. So the story is he shows up here because they're in battle and they're like, all right, we surrender. And he shows up and Grant is wearing a private uniform. He looks awful. And he shows up and he meets Lee. What gets really weird, and everybody here, like how everybody kind of looks weird, like, oh, what is happening here? That actually was an experience because Grant's hero is Robert E. Lee. He's like, man, this guy's so awesome. He beat all these people. He shows up, shakes his hands, like, oh, hey, man, this is awesome. This is, all this stuff is wonderful. He goes and wants to go play by play of all the cool stuff that Lee had done throughout the war to beat all these Union generals. He's like, hey, dude, remember that time you did this and that? And it really makes everybody awkward because the people here says it looks like Grant is surrendering to Lee because Grant is just like fanboying this up. And it's like, oh, it's Lee. And it actually has to be Lee that's like, hey, can we go in here and get this started? And Grant's like, sure, absolutely. So they go inside here and they sit down. And now Grant tells Lee, I've already talked to Lincoln. Here are what's going to happen with this surrender. Now, Lee knows he's going to be executed. You literally just led the entire military against the United States. The United States, it's treason. Lee knows he's going to be executed. His officers will be executed. His main goal here is not to have his soldiers executed because there's not a lot left. Don't have them executed. So that's Lee's only goal here. But, he's like, dead man walking kind of thing, but don't kill my soldiers. So Grant's like, all right, so here's what's going to happen. Number one, let's talk about your soldiers. And Lee's like, all right. And he says, all right, we're going to let them go home. But they're going to give us their weapons, any military stuff they have, all of that, and they're going to swear that they're never going to do this again, or they're going to prison, if they ever try to attack America again. This is extremely lenient for what Lee was expecting. He's like, absolutely, I'm cool with that. And then Grant's like, all right, let's talk about your officers. So your officers, they're going to go home too. We're going to let them keep their horses, but they're going to turn in all their weapons. And Lee's like, all right, man, cool. And so his officers in the back, like, yes, thank you, super lenient. Then he says, all right, now you specifically, Lee, you're a little different. Lee's like, I understand, and he's like, stretching out his neck, thinking he's getting ready to get hanged. And he's like, you you're going to go home. We're going to let you keep your rank. We're going to let you keep your weapons and everything like that. You just go home and don't cause no more problems. And Lee is like, what? And he's like, yeah, that's what Lincoln said. Those are the terms. You better like them. And Lee's like, oh, I'm happy with them. And Lee, more than happy, he signs it here. The terms of surrender are so wildly lenient on the South here, specifically because what has to happen right after this war? The South and the North have to come back together. If you because Robert E. Lee is a hero in the South. If you execute him, you've made him a martyr. And by doing so, it's going to be harder to bring the South back in because it's just causing more tensions. So they tell Lee, just go home, sit down, and shut up. And that's what Lee does. So, I mean, Lee lives on he's super rich. He has a big area. So that's what Lee does. He goes home. He ends up dying years later of old age, and constantly comes out and was the best advocate for the end of this war because he was still alive and says, no, we lost the war. Once he signs this and everybody leaves, the South is like, Robert E. Lee didn't really surrender. We're going to keep fighting. And then Robert E. Lee's like, no, we surrendered. And they're like, so you just told them we surrendered. We're going to keep fighting. He's like, no, we for real legitimately surrendered. The war's over. And they're like, so we're going to let them keep thinking that. And Robert E. Lee's like, no, we did everything we could, guys. We lost this one. All right. The fact that Lee stood by and had the integrity to constantly battle against this idea that the South is going to rise again really helps out this surrender because Lee, for the rest of his life, just completely admits that they lost. They did what they could, and that was that. So the war is officially over. So the question here is, why were the terms of surrender so lenient for Robert E. Lee and the Confederate soldiers? What does this tell you about how the United States expected to move forward after the Civil War? So we talked about that, so pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So the war is over. Abraham Lincoln had gotten elected in 1860. The South leaves. 700,000 people get killed fighting the Civil War. Now the war is over, and he won. All right? Not only that, while the war was taking place, from 1860 to 1865, Abraham Lincoln had a young child in the White House, his own child, got sick and died. His wife had an emotional breakdown from it and had to be institutionalized during the Civil War because of the loss of her child and the stresses involved. So Lincoln, while having to become a master of military strategy, something he'd never done before because he had no generals, is dealing with the grief of his child, his wife that's having a breakdown. Look at these pictures right here, side by side. I think I've showed it to you in the last unit. This is Abraham Lincoln 5 years apart. That's what stress will do to you. The level of stress that this man was under is just incomprehensible. Let me back at it here so I don't block it here. So the war's over. This man ain't had a day off in forever. His wife is doing better. She's back in the White House. And he said, oh my gosh, the war is over. 13th Amendment is passed. Slavery is ended. We did it. And his wife's like, yes, absolutely. And they're like, you know what? We need a date night. All right, we ain't been out in half a decade. Let's go on a date. So they're like, cool. So they're going to go down the street to watch a play at a place called Ford's Theater. This is a modern picture of it, still a very famous theater playhouse. And Abraham Lincoln and his wife are going to go to this theater. Again, war has just ended. Everything is, I's are dotted, T's are crossed. Hooray, we can get back to normal. He goes to this theater in order to watch a play. Inside the theater, and this is, again, it's still a functioning theater. Inside this is where Abraham Lincoln is going to sit, is up in the balcony. Because he's not going to, it's the president of the United States. There's still, you're the president. There's always people that are going to dislike you. So he's not going to be down with the regular population, but he's going to be sitting up here in the balcony with his wife and I think another couple. And they're going to watch this play. First time he's been out in forever. Well, this dude gets involved. This is a man named John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth is a Southern sympathizer. He's one of these guys that thinks Robert E. Lee's surrender isn't really real, that the South is going to rise again, and that the war is still going on. So John Wilkes Booth goes to this theater, and it's like a bigger conspiracy. Other people are supposed to do stuff, but for this class, John Wilkes Booth goes to this theater, and his job is he is going to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. All right, because he thinks by doing so, this will help the South win the war. The war is over. But again, there are Southerners like John Wilkes Booth that think the war's not actually over. So John Wilkes Booth goes up the stairs behind. I guess they didn't have the Secret Service and stuff like they do today, like the security, because John. Now keep in mind, John Wilkes Booth isn't some ruffian, dirty-looking guy. He is a affluent, wealthy. Like he probably would have been recognized by some of the other wealthier people that are there. So he had made his way up to the booth where Lincoln is at. Lincoln is watching the play. Mid-play, John Wilkes Booth pulls out a gun and shoots Abraham Lincoln point blank in the back of the head, killing him immediately. John Wilkes Booth then jumps off the front of the stage, or jumps off the front of the balcony, right, and lands on the stage. His foot actually gets caught on this flag here, and he lands awkwardly on the stage and actually breaks his leg when he lands on the stage. But he just murdered the president, and he's got all his adrenaline, so he hops up when he hits on the stage, and he screams to the crowd, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means ever this the tyrants. It's in Latin. And then says, "The South is avenged." All right. And then scampers off the stage with a broken leg, hops on a horse behind the theater, and takes off and escapes. The reaction of the crowd is surprising, but then not really. When this happens and he runs off stage, and the crowd claps, and you're like, "Oh, they all must have hated Lincoln that much." Not the case at all. The reason they all clap is it's such a shocking turn of events. They think it's part of the play. And I did not see that one coming. And they're like, Lincoln, he bleeds really effectively and convincingly. And they're like, oh my gosh. By the time they realize he's actually been assassinated, that John Wilkes Booth escaped. Now, John Wilkes Booth, he keeps a diary that ends up being found later on. And this is very interesting. When Abraham Lincoln was shot, now he had just won re-election, the war is over, but he wasn't super popular. The South still hated him. When John Wilkes Booth assassinates Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, and we know this from his diary, fully thought that he would be a hero. He killed this evil tyrant leader that he assumes what everybody else thought. So what happens is when he kills Abraham Lincoln, people start liking Abraham Lincoln more. They're like, dude, I didn't like the guy. You don't shoot him. And even people in the South, not all of them, there's still a lot of people that didn't like Abraham Lincoln. They're like, not cool, John Wilkes Booth. What are you doing? And John Wilkes Booth is on the run. There's a huge manhunt to try to find him. And he is really shocked. He writes in his journal, he cannot believe he is not considered a hero, but he is absolutely considered a villain. He ends up getting cornered in a barn somewhere. Had to be separate from the diary because the diary makes it out. And he gets surrounded in a barn here. And they're like, all right, John Wilkes Booth, come on out here. You're under arrest for assassinating the president. And he's like, come in here. And he's got like guns and stuff. And they're like, no. So they set the barn on fire to make him come out. And he doesn't. So John Wilkes Booth dies in this fire, and they know it's him because the skeleton afterwards had a broken leg. So John Wilkes Booth is going to die then, but the biggest change is the fact that Andrew Johnson becomes the president. This was Abraham Lincoln's vice president. Remember why he's really important? Because when Abraham Lincoln picked Andrew Johnson to be his vice president, Lincoln didn't think he was going to win. So he needed to get all the votes he could. So he picks a Democrat, a Northern Democrat, a guy that supports slavery, to be his running mate. He just became the president. So the entire government is Republicans because the South is still a separate country, has yet to be brought back in. Everybody's a Republican except for the president, who's a Democrat who hates all the Republicans, and all the Republicans hate the Democrats. So the guy that's got to kind of put America back together without slavery is a guy that supports slavery. And tensions are going to skyrocket in the federal government after this because the president of the United States goes from being Abraham Lincoln, who wrote the 13th Amendment, to a pro-slavery Democrat because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So the question here is, how did the assassination of Lincoln drastically change the federal government politically immediately following the Civil War? So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so here at the end of the lesson, a couple of things you need to understand. The war ends. War's over. It is Reconstruction time. So the South has to be rebuilt. That's what you're going to be reconstructing, the South. North wins. The North doesn't have to change a lot. But the South has to change. Now, granted, it's still going to be an agricultural community. That's just what they do. But slavery's over. How do you bring the South back in, restructure them so that all the tensions that caused the Civil War don't happen again? To make sure that, because obviously the South's going to be resistant to changing their entire way of life, the federal government is going to send troops into the South. The entire South gets put under martial law. Basically, at gunpoint, they have to throw out slavery, they have to have new elections, they have to re-agree to the Constitution, basically with the federal government and the military, the Union soldiers in the South, making sure this happens in every single state. The Southerners hated Reconstruction. The Northerners liked it because you're trying to put America back together. People were real wanting to hug this out. There is tensions, but the goal here is kind of to hug it out and move past this. But you have to crack some eggs to make an omelet. You have to have the government force the South to make these changes because they're not going to do it on their own. And this time period is going to be referred to as Reconstruction because you're having to rebuild the South. So the question here is, explain what needed to be reconstructed after the Civil War and how the United States government intended to make sure it happened. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So here, it's an undertaking for Reconstruction. The war destroyed 2/3 of the South's shipping industry. 9,000 miles of railroad, reduced property value by 70%. The number here, 624,000 soldiers died. There's now idea it's more like 720. Planters lost $3 billion in labor. 4 million slaves are now freed. All right. There's still a question on what do you do with the slaves now that they are freed, and we're going to talk more about that as we move on in a future lesson. There is this kind of I'm so glad that is over. 700,000 people died. Everybody's like, you know what? Let's just move on. And a lot of people just want to hug it out and go back like nothing happened. All right. Granted, you got to get rid of slavery and all that, but let's just move on and forget this evil part of history. There's a lot of Republicans in the North that want to move on from this and just fix everything, move on. Well, there's a big part of the Republicans like, hold on now. They just declared war on the United States. It's the South's fault for this. They need to be punished. And half the Republicans want to just move on from the war, fix stuff and move on. The other half of the Republicans want to punish the South for the Civil War. And the part of the Republican Party that wants to punish the South are called radical Republicans. They're like, there has to be consequences to this. And so there is a large part of the Republican Party that wants to see punishment done to the South because of this war. So the question here is, explain who supported Reconstruction. That one, the North is going to support it because they're going to make the South look more like the North and follow their laws. Who hated Reconstruction? The South, because they're going to have to redo their entire life at gunpoint with the United States military. And then explain why the Republican Party split into two different schools of thought at that time. And that's what we just got done talking about. So answer that completely. That's what I got for you guys today. See you guys tomorrow.